Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Latino Vote Podcast with your two favorite old bald-headed Mexicans, Chuck Rocha and Mike Madrid. We got back last week to let everybody know we were going to be back doing this on a regular basis because there has been a swell, I would say, Mike, a groundswell of energy, folks wanting to hear mine and your voice for some reason.
The demand is out there, and we've got to give the people what they require. So here we are back at it, back in the saddle. Lots to talk about. You know, it's funny, Chuck, because there was so much that we didn't cover when we were, in the shadows and went dark for a little bit. But all that made me realize was we're not going to be struggling for content. There's going to be so much going on in this election year on this topic where we can be having, a great dialogue between us and some great guests. And it's good to be back. It's good to make this routine again. And I'm looking forward to this year, especially as we wake up from the results of the New Hampshire primary. And I was actually looking for, and I found for the first time some articles about the Latino vote in New Hampshire. Did the same thing in Iowa. They're not very discernible. But what I do want to hopefully start off our conversation today with is a quick chat about what you saw in the results, what you saw from the New Hampshire primary and what it means for the overall electorate. We're obviously going to spend a lot of time on Latino voters, but let's just talk big picture here. You've been in the saddle before as a campaign number one on a presidential. And what did you see last night? What does it tell you? What are the tea leaves telling Chuck Rocha heading into the general election after New Hampshire last night?
Well, there's not going to be a new comeback kid, and there ain't going to be the Barack Obama "Yes, we can" speech. And for all of you historians out there, both of those happened in New Hampshire. That is where Barack Obama got second place to Hillary Clinton, and he did the big "Yes, we can" speech. It was the Bill Clinton comeback kid thing. And let's just be clear that Donald Trump whooped Nikki Haley's ass last night in New Hampshire. But what does that mean? What does that mean going forward? Me and Mike can pontificate on that for a while, but what it means is even in a state where independents and Democrats can vote in a Republican primary because they can change on the spot, and there's more independent voters in Live Free or Die, New Hampshire than any place in the country. And she still could not even, in my opinion, get close because, in my opinion, 11 points ain't close. She should have been much closer if she has a real campaign. The problem with Nikki Haley is she's not popular with Republicans. And guess what you need to win a Republican primary? Other Republicans. So they're already starting to look down the road at where there's other states where independents can vote, like places like Michigan. And I'll shut up here in a second, but I do want to say this. As somebody who ran a presidential campaign for somebody who was very popular with independents, Bernie Sanders, we won every single primary where independents could vote in the primary. So I get this piece. So going out and reaching out, me and Mike Madrid had a lot of conversations on this podcast about non-party preference voters in California because they were a big part of my strategy. We spent millions of dollars to Latinos, who, by the way, the biggest portion of Latinos and the fastest growing in California is no party preference. I'll openly admit that as a Democrat. But that's Haley's problem, is not only is she not popular with Republicans, she wasn't popular enough with independents in New Hampshire to make a big deal. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's 100% right. What I will say is I don't know that, and I've been saying, for the past 6-8 years, this is Donald Trump's party, right? There's never, ever been a real threat. Nikki Haley was never going to win. Ron DeSantis was never going to win. There's never been a true alternative candidate to Donald Trump. Most of these people were just, it was more of an audition running for their hopeful roles as either the VP or for secretary of whatever in the cabinet. And that's why you've got Vivek back there and Tim Scott just embarrassing himself, just humiliating himself on stage. Horrible. Yeah, people should not be allowed to debase themselves like that much in public. But there was Tim Scott doing his thing. So the question really for me became, from just a data perspective, is how much of Nikki Haley's vote was actually anti-Trump vote? Because this race is going to November. We're going to have Joe Biden. We're going to have Donald Trump in a rematch. And what I will say is this: the actual number of Republican voters that are anti-Trump is about not quite 2.5 times, but more than double than what it was 4 years ago this January, heading into the 2020 election. when I was in the Lincoln Project going, man, I've never seen anything like this before. This dude's got 91, 92% of the Republican base locked up. And when I started kind of floating this theory that if we could just get 4 to 7% and Biden could get the turnout that they needed amongst Democrats, that we would be able to beat this guy with just 4 to 7%. That tells you how much you need the Republican base to be intact for a Republican to be competitive. Donald Trump is nowhere near that right now. He's nowhere near that. In fact, when all the dust was settled in the November 2020 election, 9% of Republicans had shifted. We exceeded that number, got to 9%. Joe Biden wins. We are sitting today in a range between 15 and 19% of Republicans saying they will not vote for Donald Trump in November. That's extraordinary. That's massive. It doesn't sound massive. And I know a lot of folks are out there going, I can't believe that 15 people total are voting for this guy. And I get that. But when you're talking 15, 20% of your base is peeling off, you got trouble in the base. And that's where Donald Trump is at. There's a lot of red flashing warning signs going off. It's a 5-alarm fire in Trump headquarters. Frankly, that's why he was so pissed off. I mean, the guy's pissed off all the time, but why he was particularly salty, given his acceptance speech after New Hampshire, is it's clear that Trump world thought that they were going to win this thing by 25, 30 points. It ended up being pretty close to about single digits. And the reason for that is because independents broke hard against him, and I think will again in November. And I think, as I've been saying, the fundamentals are lining up in this race to look very positive for Joe Biden for a re-election of a Democrat. I've been saying since the midterms, I think it's going to be as strong a year as 1996 was for Clinton against Dole. For some of you older listeners,
I was skinny and had hair then.
Yeah, I think Chuck was around when Bob Dole. You guys were kids together, weren't you?
We were.
Yeah.
We used to play stickball in the alley behind the old warehouse. Anyway, God dang it. Let me say this about this. So you think that 14% of folks that would vote are anti-Trump, or is that 14% of Republicans or the general electorate?
14% of Republicans.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I think this will be an ongoing theme.
Yep.
And I would agree with that. I don't know if 14% is right. I think it's probably in the ballpark for sure. I think the real thing here is definitely there's a group of Republicans who don't like Donald Trump. And will they vote for Joe Biden or skip that on the ballot? I think part of them will vote for Joe Biden. I think another part of them will skip it. What we don't talk about enough, and this has a lot to do with Latinos, not in New Hampshire, not in South Carolina, but in battleground states in the general, is these new voters who will show up and vote who've never had an opportunity to vote for Donald Trump before, who aren't really engaged. They just see the noise and the chatter on TikTok or Instagram or somewhere at Fox News. And they could be watching some MSNBC here, but these folks ain't watching network TV because they're 18 to 22 because they haven't voted before. And normally that is a bedrock group of progressive Democrats. Even if they're Latino, Black, no matter their skin color, young people normally align with those values. But I think Trump is an anomaly with some of that. I think if you add the anomaly of him being like cool to young rednecks who never voted or had a reason to vote, he gives them a reason to vote because of his bombastic, somewhat racist comments on lots of things. And I think if you couple that with this ongoing heat about Israel and Palestine, and you saw him get interrupted last night in Virginia at a rally. I can't use my words this morning, but it was an organized thing that's not going away. And it's people say to me all the time, Chuck, is this going to have this Gaza and the war stuff going to have an effect? I'm like, in places like Michigan, where there's hundreds of thousands of Muslim Democratic voters, it will have an effect. And then you start adding on folks who won't vote for Trump. And then you start looking at new folks who have been brought into the system because they've never voted before. I think this is where the election is won and lost in the next round.
So let's riff with this a little bit, because this is great to be talking to a Democrat who's very involved with races from the top to bottom and seeing what's happening in the Middle East right now. And when you see these voters in Michigan, and you know, we're talking very significant numbers in Michigan, Arab Americans who've been motivated by all of these events and the Palestinian movement. How it does is the fear that they will actually move towards like a Donald Trump to punish, or they just won't show up? Is that they don't see a difference anymore in Joe Biden or Donald Trump, or am I missing something?
It's segmented in what I'm seeing, and obviously the older class are definitely going to vote. They'll probably skip the top of the ticket if this is a motivating factor for them. And I think that with young people, where this is like centerpiece of their existence, as it should be, especially if they have lineage and heritage in that area of the world, I think that enough of them could not vote in certain states to have an effect. That's why I think that the Democrats need this to go away. We need to be talking about the unemployment rate, the skyrocketing stock market while gas prices are going down. That's the narrative we want to have, not about something that's kind of out of our control of these groups of what happened over in Israel. Is just a deflection on an economy that's done so much better, getting better every day. The ads write themselves about the stock market going up and gas prices coming down, bread coming down. You don't see those ads being wrote because right now everybody's protesting this. And so it's taking the oxygen out of the room of a narrative we need to combat Donald Trump, in my opinion.
I see. Okay, I get that. I understand that. And I'm sure at some point we will talk about Latinos specifically because and their views on the Middle East and foreign policy generally, because so much of the media talks about the youth vote, and that's good. And those numbers are, there are some warning signs for the Biden campaign, but we don't talk enough about how much overlap there really is between the youth vote and the Latino vote. They're not one for one, but there's a lot of overlap, isn't there?
Giant. This is the thing that we get wrong more than any single thing. And that's a big step for me and my party. But we assume, and some of the assumption is right. The problem with politics and targeting is that it's not one size fits all and there's not one silver bullet. Are Latinos a bigger part of the youth vote than any other demographic? Yes, it's just a fact. Our average age is 27. We're just a younger population. But when you if you take the time to target that group of voters, you're targeting them as the youth. You're not segmenting out Latinos in that. Now, does that still get a large percentage of those Latinos that act like white young kids? For sure. My kid, who's 30 years old, acts like the white people in his neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where there's not a lot of Latino culture in his community. He watches what they watch, and he would fall in line. But in other places, you got to segment that out, because I'll promise you a young Latino is not watching the same things on digital that a young white person is one for one.
Right.
But if you're a lazy consultant and you've only got so much time and money, and you have a demographic that doesn't turn out at the same rate as older voters, especially these white suburban voters that me and you talk so much about, then you start losing pieces of that who are more susceptible to the Donald Trump message because they're not hearing from the Democrat, and they get sucked into this whirlwind around whatever it may be. You could pick one of the issue topics that Donald Trump uses to get in there with folks, but that's how we start losing, as you said before, very much on the numbers. 1% here, 2% here, 5% here. And that's how you start. The erosion is the fancy word I'm looking for.
Erosion of that margin. That's exactly right. Let me poke at this a little bit more, because Chuck's saying something really important. And a lot of journalists, I know we've got a lot of journalists who listen in. No one has really written this story with what Chuck has said. So this is a great story for some of you bright minds out there. When I read, and obviously a lot of folks are writing stories on the youth vote and kind of Biden's weakness with the youth vote. And there's sort of this general acknowledgement that there's this weakness, but that it can be solidified. And I agree with that, by the way. I think the vast majority of Biden's weakness is going to come home come election time. The race gets real. The Biden campaign starts spending money and messaging and driving this stuff, and the vast majority will come home. But then there's this Latino segment, right? And people kind of go, wow, is it happening? Is it not happening? Where is it happening? What does it mean? Blah, blah, blah. Look, you can't have one without the other. You can't. There's just too many young Latino voters. There's too many. The overlap, the circles that cover each other in the Venn diagram are too big. And you can't treat youth voters as just youth voters, and you can't and shouldn't treat Latino voters as just Latino voters. This younger Latino demographic is going to be an absolutely critical component to a Biden reelect if it's going to happen. It's huge. I think the number that's out there, that's floating out there, is 38% of the Latino vote will have voted in 2018 or more recently. That means in either 2018, 2020, or 2022. Almost 40% of the Latino vote is only old enough to have voted in those 3 elections, 2 midterms and 1 general election. That is a jaw-dropping statistic, and it should bring into clarity and focus just how significant and how fast this segment of the electorate is going to grow. But it's all young, and it's a huge swath of the Latino vote. So you can't say, oh, we got a problem with young people, but not a problem with Latino voters. Or you can't say we've got a problem with Latinos, but not young voters. There's too much overlap with these concentric circles. They are one and the same, but they cannot be approached the same way. The way you're talking to somebody who's non-Hispanic white and Hispanic white who's 21, 22 years old should be, if you're doing some good consulting work, good campaign work, completely different strategies, completely different messaging. Even if you're monolingual English, they are different strategies, different message, different platforms. That's what Chuck, I think, is trying to say, or maybe even said it more eloquently than I did. But that is one of the stories of the 2024 election cycle that hasn't been examined quite enough.
I think that there's something needs to be said, and this will be a theme that's a different Chuck Rocha theme than last season that I'll start today, that you should know will be a drumbeat for me. I have been very, very hard on my party and hard on their Latino outreach operations. And I've been doing this for 34 years, a long time. And I will honestly tell you that things have changed. And I think some of that probably has to do with me and Mike Madrid. It has to do with other people who've been giving them advice. And at the national party level, at the national super PAC level, and I will promise you at the Biden campaign, they know what we're saying, and things have changed, dramatically changed since Donald Trump, pretty much. Donald Trump was a slap in the face to Democrats when we saw him move the Latino vote 8 points. We now, pretty much flattened that line out in an off year, and nobody knows what to expect this year. Well, Democrats at the national campaigns, at the party committees, and then redistricting, and we'll have a whole segment about redistricting and about how these congressional seats are so much more Latino than we've ever seen before. All of that being said, is the national parties now and the party committees and their super PACs are doing more work than I have ever seen them do to reach our community. And they are doing things that I used to sit back and throw rocks at all the time of, you don't start early enough. You don't hire Latino consultants. You're not messaging in a culturally competent way. Well, guess what, girls and boys, whether you like it or not, they're doing that now. Now, I'll pick at the campaigns on the ground all day. That's still a weakness in many of the congressional and Senate races and lack of diversity and voices there. But the national parties have been like, no, we're not going to give up on this Latino vote. We're going to double down. There was more spending in Spanish language advertising in the off-year election by Democrats than ever in the history. By the way, outspending Republicans 5-1. Is it still perfect? No. But at the national level, I see resources going that way. So folks are starting to be like, oh, shit. What happened with Donald Trump? This move was real. We need to do something instead of sitting back and say, we've got it all figured out. They've started spending money. And I'm going to get into that throughout other episodes, because you can talk to me all day about how great your Latino outreach is. But until I see a receipt, I ain't going to believe it. And to be honest, I'm starting to see receipts.
Yeah, which is remarkable because it is January and you were already seeing it, and you involved with some efforts in the middle and late of the off year that had never happened before.
Never, not that early.
Yeah. So let's kind of shift gears just a little bit and talk about sort of the coverage of what's going to be happening in with coverage of the Latino vote. Just as you're saying, just as it's getting more mainstream, just as the understanding and the nuance of Latino voters who are going to be kind of changing the outcome of all of these races from the House and this balance in the Senate to the White House, the Los Angeles Times. Any Latinos
live around that Los Angeles Times area?
It's heartbreaking. This is the media market with the largest Latino community in America by a large stretch. Laid off about 115 of its reporters, fully 1/3 of its newsroom. 38% of the reporters who were laid off were Latino.
Jesus.
38%. Now, I've been critical because even in California, where I'm from, Chuck, and you've come out and visited beautiful California before.
Oh my God, Sacramento. My God.
Let's not listen. We can set Sacramento aside. But when I did Antonio Villaraigosa's race for governor, we did not have a single, this was 2018, we did not have a single Latino journalist covering the race. Not one in California.
Wow.
With the Latino community here in California is obviously the largest ethnic, plurality. It was 40% of the state is Hispanic and 34 is white. Not a single Latino political journalist was given the beat of covering the governor's race with what could have been the first Latino governor in over 100 years in this state, since Romualdo Pacheco.
I don't even know how to say that first name.
Yeah, Republican.
What? That's what I don't know.
Yeah, last Hispanic, right? Last Latino Hispanic governor of California, first and only was Latino. But anyway, that's an episode for another day. My point is the chances of Latinos covering politics broadly or in the Latino community was just basically decimated. It was bad anyway. Okay, Chuck. This was the Latino number of Latino reporters was bad 2 days ago. It got much worse yesterday. And telling the nuance of the stories that you and I are talking about get harder because there aren't reporters who either understand or grasp or frankly are interested in these topics, which is why we haven't gotten the kind of coverage that we've had. You have pulled together informal mini conferences of Latino reporters that are doing the national beat now. That you gathered a good group of us to meet in Chicago earlier last year. I was elated because in my 30 plus years, I was going to give you the real number, but 30 plus years of doing this, there were not enough Latino journalists doing this. There was maybe 3 or 4. Now there's like, a good dozen or two at the top newspapers in America. And I'm just heartbroken by what this means because it's going to significantly set back all of the progress that has been made in terms of covering and understanding the nuances of the fastest growing segment of the electorate. And a bunch of reporters that are unfortunately lost their roles in the paper yesterday. I know a bunch. We've worked with them and some of the brightest minds in journalism broadly, but just a sad day at the LA Times.
Yeah. And, I appreciate you texting me, and I didn't even know it had happened until you had texted me. And then I started getting texts from other people and our friends. And the first thing I thought about was our good friend, Professor Cadava up in Northwestern, where me and you got to go last year. Professor Jerry Cadava up in Northwestern works with the journalism school. They're one of the top journalist schools in the country. Mm-hmm. There are lots of Latino journalists. Some of our friends, our sister Sabrina over at the Washington Post and lots of the others went to that school. And I learned that, as most of you know, I haven't spent a lot of time on a college campus. So Mike was walking me around and showing me how people learn in the big schools like Northwestern. But it was cool to be in a room full of brown people who wanted to understand the community and covering the community to make sure. This was a group of people who wanted to make sure that they were covering the community in a way that reflected the community, learning as much as they could about the electorate. They're from the community, so they're already great reporters on the community. But knowing the political nuances that me and you got to sit with journalists from every aspect of journalism, from CBS News to the Washington Post to the Texas Tribune, from all over the country came there because what the professor had done to bring folks together in a 2-day symposium to talk about our community, covering our community and what politics would have an effect on. Today that meeting just got a lot more important, not less important, but more important because there's less of us covering this.
Yeah.
If you think the way that me and Mike say that there's not enough Latinos running campaigns and enough Latinos making decisions in the DNC or the RNC, that's true. It's still as bad today as it ever was. There's less than 1% of us in those rooms. You want to walk into a newsroom, it's the same as a political consulting room. There's not very many of us in that room. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of white reporters misreporting on our community. Like there's a lot of white consultants misrunning outreach because they think they know better because they read about it in a book, but they have no idea what it is in real time. Last 2 points on this are, last year was the inaugural White House Correspondents' Dinner Brown and Boozy Brunch that I created. Mm-hmm. Guess what? To honor Latino journalists, because I was sick and tired of seeing our brown sisters and brothers not get the recognition at the White House Correspondents' Dinners that they deserve. So this year we're coming back in April at the White House Correspondents' Dinner and having a brunch for Latino journalists. And guess what, Mike? We're going to be giving out scholarships to Latino journalists. But unless we do something in these newsrooms, there's not going to be jobs for these kids to even have. And when you're specifically talking about the LA Times, y'all, and I'll stop my big rant here, the United States House of Representatives will be determined on about 5 House races in California that all have more than 40% Latino population. California 9, 13, 22, 45, all of those. And where's the Latino reporters who are going to be telling the story of Latino voters that determined who controls our government? That's why this is so important that we have more Latino journalists, not less journalists.
And because this just happened, as of this recording, this happened just, yesterday. I actually did send some notes to some folks, and maybe this was terrible of me, but I was like, hey, we'd love to have somebody on to talk. I wrote the Latino caucuses. There's actually a Latino caucus of the LA Times Guild, Latino writers who joined as a Latino caucus in their union, and reached out and said, hey, Chuck and I'd love to have somebody on. I think it was too soon. And then I felt like one of those ambulance chasers, just felt awful about myself for even asking.
Point. I didn't think about that.
But it is. I mean, this is really, really important, folks out there. This is really important because as the electorate gets more complicated, you got to have people with the experience, the expertise and understanding to kind of articulate it and explain what is happening as our democracy changes, as it transforms. But we will in the coming days and or weeks bring some reporters on, or at least some media observers to give us their insight as to what this is going to mean, because the Los Angeles Times drives a lot of this coverage that other reporters will pick up and say, hey, here's a good story. This is something we should be focused on, because there were so many Latinos in the newsroom and among the rank of journalists covering these stories. So sad day. But we will survive and move on. And it's just I just hate seeing journalists en masse losing their roles, because it's just such an important part of the process.
Hats off to all of you out there. Any of you who've lost your job at the LA Times. We're going to be continuing this podcast. We'll talk to you as much as we can when you're ready to talk. Sorry to interrupt you, Mike.
No, that's exactly right. Thanks for that. And let me, can I shift gears once again to yet another topic? Going
to the top gear, last topic of the day. And when I used to gear down, we called it granny gear, but go ahead.
Chuck and I, often share stories as they come across and go, is this a story? Is this not a story? And yesterday was one of those days. I'm going to give my perception of this story, because I think Chuck is, one of those rare instances, much smarter than I am on this topic.
Oh, shit. There we go. This is going to be so bad. Much
more understanding. And so he's going to have the closing words on this. But something I think quite extraordinary happened yesterday. And I was extremely impressed by the way this was handled. And it actually gave me some reassurance that the Biden campaigns really got their act together. And here's what happened. About an hour before the polls in New Hampshire closed, the New York Times ran a quick snippet saying that some of the higher-ups in the Biden administration, the top people running the government, longtime close Biden allies and associates, some going back to the 1980s that have been with Joe Biden, were moving up to Delaware. They were leaving the West Wing, they were leaving the Oval, and they were heading up to be on the ground with the campaign in Delaware. And first of all, when a story like that breaks out of the White House in the middle of the rest of the country and world focused entirely on something else, it's happening that way for a reason. And that's because they didn't want the story to get a whole lot of traction, which is a very sophisticated way of operating and doing something. And so to me, I was like, damn, something's happening, right? Of course, as an old political hand, I'm looking at things entirely differently than everybody else in the country. And I'm like, why are they dropping this big of news in the middle of, the time when 99% of politicals are focused somewhere else? And my estimation was because they're making a change at the top. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the current campaign manager is Julie Chavez Rodriguez. And I don't know if it was Rodriguez Chavez or Chavez Rodriguez, but it's Chavez Rodriguez. And Julie, Chuck knows Julie. I do not, but I'm sure she's very, very capable, competent, and solid at what she does. But it's also undeniable that the Biden campaign has been stuck in a low gear. I don't know if it's granny gear or not. I've never driven a tractor and I don't plan on it, so I don't know what you'd call it. But the wheels have been spinning, not getting a lot of traction, and they're not moving the numbers the way that they have. Also, another little bit of interesting tidbit and data as I follow these crumbs like Hansel and Gretel on the way to grandma's house. I don't even know if I got that right, but you know what I'm talking about.
This is going downhill quick.
This is going downhill. So Obama and Biden have a lunch just 10 days ago where President Obama tells Biden, you need to get your campaign together, brother. Things aren't looking good. You're stuck in the mud. The wheels are spinning. You got to get some traction. You got to make some, have clear lines of decision making. Now, any good, solid political also knows that when the former president and the current president has lunch, if that leaks to the press, not just that they're having it, but the content of that lunch, there's only a couple people who know what they're talking about if they want it to. So this was leaked consciously by Biden, by Obama, and the people at the top. They're signaling that a change is coming and things are going to change. They drop the next bit of news an hour before the polls close in New Hampshire. And I'm like, am I taking crazy pills or am I the only one watching this story unfold in real time? Shit's about to change at the Biden campaign. And from my estimation, sure as shit, that's exactly what has happened. Now, this doesn't mean anything like light your hair on fire and start running around in circles. I think this is a very good development. The best and brightest that Biden has, the people that were in the number 1, number 2, number 3 spots in the 2020 campaign are back in the saddle in Delaware in that role running that operation. Now, that doesn't mean that anybody got fired. I don't think it means that. But what I will say is this. On a presidential campaign, if somebody does get fired, it doesn't happen the way it happened to Brad Parscale, where he gets kicked out by Trump and thrown on the plane and goes back and has a meltdown and, big domestic violence situation with his girlfriend after drinking a 12-pack of Bud Light, in the middle of the Keys, Florida. That's not the way it normally happens. That's Trump world. The way it happens is when you fire somebody, you say, no titles are changing. No, chain of command is changing. This is the way that we were always going to do it. But in practical reality, everybody knows that the decision maker has changed. All of this is very deep inside baseball, but I think it's extremely significant because I think there was a lot of nervousness in Democrat land with people saying this campaign is not moving numbers. The operation you have is not moving numbers. Get the people who did it last time back in those roles. Let's get these people back in the number 1, the number 2 positions. I don't want to say that Julie Chavez Rodriguez has been sidelined, but I'm going to say Julie Chavez Rodriguez has been sidelined. And I don't think it's just been her. I think it's the entire operation that was working underneath or below her. So tell me if that's wrong, Chuck, because you would know far better than I. I'm just this caveman political consultant who doesn't understand the way things work.
When he said my opinion, that's what you needed to know. It was my, because I don't have the same opinion. So I do about the dropping of the news. Like if you want to hide some news, drop it an hour after the polls close, but I digress. So look, Julie's my friend. She was in charge before the primary last night. She's in charge after. She didn't get fired. She still has the same job. She still has the same authority, in my opinion. The one thing that we all know is that we don't know. You don't know the internal structure. We think we know. Mike thinks he knows. I think I know. But neither one of us can really prove that we're right. But what I can prove is that I've been in the chair. And the chair is as the senior advisor. So the same job that Jen O'Malley's kind of doing was the job Jeff Weaver had. And Jeff Weaver was the senior, had run the campaign last time, came back as an advisor, me as a chief strategist and advisor, and we hired a manager. Faz, who did a wonderful job. And I'll tell you that this is how campaigns normally work. And if you don't think that Donaldson or Jen O'Malley Dillon wasn't already having input in the campaign while sitting in the White House, then you're all crazy. Not you, Mike. We know you're crazy, but I mean, everybody's crazy. So I definitely think that this is a signal to keep some folks happy that we're worried about the campaign. But there's also something I know is that Julie's done a great job And now she's got some more help to do the job. If they weren't going to give her the job and they were going to replace her, they would have moved her to the DNC. That's normally what happens with a manager who they're like, we're going to move them over here because we need more help over here, which is a wink and a nod that they're not fired, but they moved them somewhere else. She stayed in the job because, in my opinion, she was in charge before and she has some help. There's so much work that goes on when you pivot to a general election. This is the normality of it, in my opinion, from doing the job. Is then you start to have to expand the maps. And what we did with Faz and me is I took on the operation of all the state directors who were actually running the campaign in the states. Faz was running Bernie and running the comm shop and doing debate prep and doing all the stuff that had to do with Bernie, because you need like 3 or 4 managers when you pivot to the general election. And I think that's the biggest thing that's happened here. Plus, to Mike's point, and it's fair, is that folks that were nervous, like President Obama or others who wanted to see some things happen that would make them think that there's kind of not a changing of the guard, but just other folks coming to help, because Julie has worked with these other 2 great consultants, and there's nothing against Jen or Donaldson or any of them. They're good people. In my opinion, all hands on deck. We need more people helping to do more things, because when you're talking about a general election, you need folks in the room. And I'll tell you this as my final thought on this, as the senior advisor to a major presidential campaign, is there's normally 2 to 5 people, normally it's less than 3, who have the final say on moving big amounts of money or strategy. And that's normally one of those people, just like it still is, I am sure, with Julie Chavez Rodriguez. And she never had that power ever by herself, because that's not how presidential campaigns work. There's a media consultant, a strategist, and others who come up with it, and she has her vote. But you know what? As the campaign starts to turn towards the general, we all know Joe Biden, and he needs a comfort and a blanket that is those people who have been around him. How long has Donaldson been there, Mike? Like 100 years, however long Biden's been in the Senate. So like, to me, this does not bother me at all. And as I started the conversation, me and Mike disagree on this some, but I think she's in charge. She'll be in charge tomorrow. The last thing I'll say is very few of us brown folks get a chance to sit in the chair. And right, wrong, or indifferent, on my watch, I'm going to have her back to the end, because I am not going to let a bunch of white consultants scapegoat her for problems that they created.
Love that. Love that. That's what it's all about. And I think we can also agree that either way, however, whatever's going on, I think it's a good development. It just means that the Biden campaign is gearing up for battle. And I like the fact that they're going on the offense now. So with that, Chuck, let me say it's been great to get back into the swing of things here, making this a regular part of our week. We are looking, folks, to get as much input as we can from you guys on topics and news stories. If you aren't subscribing to the newsletter, you should be, because we are doing a roundup of all of the stories from throughout the country on what Latino stories are breaking. And like I said, what was cool is like looking at the roundup just yesterday and seeing stuff like Latinos in New Hampshire, how are they going to vote? Latinos in Iowa, like the stories are absolutely everywhere. So do us a favor. If you've got articles out there that you are seeing that maybe we haven't picked up, just go ahead and send it to us. We'll include those on the roundup, and they'll also use them as we prep for the next talk. Gearing up for a lot of new guests, a lot of good topics. And we will see you next week. Chuck, we're doing this once a week now. We'll probably into late summer start doing it twice a week if the demand is there. Give us that thumbs up, subscribe if you can, and please, please, please share widely with your friends, post on social media, because building the audience is what it's always been about. The size of this group has grown exponentially since we planned and launched about a year ago now, Chuck. It's been about a year. Wow. So if you could help us out, that would be great. It helps us keep the production team and staff going. And until then, is there anything else that I have missed?
I'll just say that I think I've aged way better than you have, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's Chuck's opinion. That's why we do this, is because I'm here to provide the facts. He's here to provide opinion. And with that, we will talk to you all next week. Have a good one.
Peace.